Little Black Bugs by Vincent V. Cava. It's important you understand that I'm not insane. I say this because the tale I'm about to recount may seem preposterous, outlandish even, so bizarre if you didn't know better. You'd think you were reading the words of a madman. Nevertheless, I assure you this narrative only contains the unequivocal truth about what happened to me, about how my life brought me to this. I'm afraid that I must write quickly, though. I wish to tell you the whole story, but unfortunately, I'll have to omit some details due to the time constraints that are being placed upon me this evening. The guests at my door are growing restless, and if I don't write this confession in a swift, prompt manner, then I fear I won't get the chance to finish it. It is for that reason that I am apologizing in advance for giving you the abbreviated version of my account. You see? A loon would never feel remorse for such a thing. My story began 6 weeks ago. I had just moved into my brother's apartment, the very one I'm composing my tale from this evening. I use the term brother loosely because that's the type of designation one might typically employ to describe another human being. Donald was more of a pig than a person, a slovenly fat oaf who did nothing but sit around in his shit-stained underwear, smoke weed, fart, and eat junk food all day. Everything about him made me sick, from the greasy, curly hair that sat atop his blubbery head, all the way down to the crusty, unkempt toenails I would often catch him nonchalantly picking at on the sofa. You should have seen the way he mined the dirt and grime that settled under those claws of his, only stopping to flick his nasty toe filth to the carpet below or to wipe it on the couch's cushion with his crud-covered fingers. Things like that often made me wonder how it was even physically possible that the same two people sired us. I would have assumed either he or I to be adopted, but unfortunately, if you looked past his pimples, greasy skin, and stretch marks, it was obvious that we bore far too much of a resemblance to each other not to be related. It was my first year at college. Donald was a junior, though I'd barely call him a student since he rarely went to class, and was hanging on to a C average by the skin of his teeth. My parents had decided that it would be best for us to room together while we were both in school. The living arrangements saved them money since they wouldn't need to pay for 2 apartments, and I think they hoped that my studious, tidy habits would rub off on my older brother. The apartment was located in student housing off campus. The building held about 40 units, all of which were inhabited by students at the university. I, of course, being the social butterfly that I am, decided to introduce myself and make friends with many of the building's tenants. This is a completely rational, non-crazy thing for a person who just moved into a new building to do, don't you think? As I went door to door shaking hands with each of my new neighbors, it became increasingly more evident that the building had a strong community atmosphere. Many of the students knew each other, and I found out there were regular soirees and get-togethers in order to help the newbies, like myself, mingle and make friends. I was having a great time meeting new people, and everyone seemed to be genuinely inviting. Of all the students in the building that I met that day, it was Elizabeth in apartment 303 whom I liked the best. She was a beautiful girl, with a sweet and charming demeanor. I like to think of myself as somewhat smooth, but I must admit, I was at a loss for words when she answered the door. It was her gorgeous green eyes that caught me off guard. They were absolutely stunning, like she was looking out at me through a pair of brilliant, gleaming emeralds. Her hair was equally as breathtaking, a dazzling auburn red. She wore knotted into a French braid that dangled carelessly over her shoulder, lightly caressing her bosom. Ah, how I longed to be that braid. If that wasn't enough, she was intelligent too. Elizabeth was in her 2nd year of school studying biochemistry, by no means an easy subject. She even had aspirations of going to graduate school and becoming a PhD, not just one of those pretty girls who gets by on her looks. No, sir. Some of the other neighbors I talked with were surprised to find out that I was not only rooming with, but also related to, my disgusting older brother. A few of them even shared horror stories about the foul stench they would sometimes encounter when they accidentally passed too closely to his apartment door on the way to the laundry room. Others joked about the stomach-turning sights that they had caught glimpses of on those rare occasions Donald opened the blinds of his windows to let sunlight into his unit. I felt a great deal of shame and embarrassment listening to the anecdotes, not just for my brother, but for myself as well. It was a curse to be related to such a revolting troll. As bad as the other tenants assumed Donald's apartment to be, I'm certain not one really had any idea just how terrible it actually was. I don't think I could have ever shown my face around that building again if they knew the truth. When I moved in, the apartment was one of the most repulsive places I had ever had the displeasure of laying my eyes upon. Donald lived alone before I became his roommate, so for 2 years, there was no one cleaning up after his overweight, unrefined ass. Trash bags full of fast food wrappers and stale, half-eaten pizza crust laid strewn about the living room, producing a smell akin to that of a hobo defecating in a McDonald's dumpster on a hot day. The fridge in the kitchen was filled with rotten meat, moldy fruit that I'm sure he never touched, and multiple containers of Tupperware, each occupied by a different putrid, soupy substance that resembled the habitat of an alien world more than something you would eat for lunch. The bathroom was even more repulsive and sickening than any porta-john you might come across at a summer music festival. The inside of the once white toilet bowl had been stained a deep orange from the years of abuse at the hands, or rather, ass, of my brother. Not once had he considered cleaning away the sludge that had collected along the walls of the pot. Tiny brown bits of fecal matter even sprinkled the seat itself. How do you get shit on the seat? Given Donald's repugnant nature, I might have understood if it was just the toilet, but the shower and sink were equally as mucky. The drains of both were clogged with the coarse black curvy hair and some sort of thick yellow goop that looked as though it might have been radioactive. Then there was his bedroom. Oh God, his bedroom. Just thinking about the way that it looked the first day makes me shudder. Where shall I start? Well, for one, there was the plastic solo cup sitting on his nightstand and windowsill, filled to the brim with urine. I'm just too tired to get up and walk to the bathroom in the middle of the night, he would later explain to me. That's why I always keep a piss cup nearby, you know, in case nature calls. Why he never thought to empty them out, I have no idea. I found wads of tissue paper soaked in what I can only assume to be the special ingredient one might use to create horrible miniature pig babies, scattered around his room like some sort of terrible Easter egg hunt from hell. His clothes were everywhere. I'm not sure if the human bag of waste had ever heard of a closet, but I'm fairly positive the concept of a washing machine was completely foreign to him, because every t-shirt or pair of socks I picked up off the floor stunk worse than George the Animal Steel's jockstrap after wrestling a 45-minute slobber knocker in Madison Square Garden. My living conditions were unfit for a barnyard animal, and desperately needed to be addressed. Some of the people that I met in the building, Elizabeth included, had invited me to a start-of-the-year barbecue. As much fun as it sounded, I was forced to decline due to the enormous amount of cleaning I had ahead of me. The last thing I wanted to do was return to the nauseating place with a belly full of red meat and beer. If I did, I can promise you one thing. My belly wouldn't stay full for long. I first noticed the insects that night when I was tidying up the kitchen. It was around 8:15, and I had just set about cleaning and disinfecting the fridge. I was dumping the last container of primordial soup down the garbage disposal when I felt a little prick on the nape of my neck. This triggered a knee-jerk reaction, causing me to reach up and grasp wildly at the source of my irritation. To my surprise, when I brought my hand back from behind my neck, I realized I had caught something between my fingers. A little black bug, no bigger than 1 millimeter in diameter. Its body was round, similar to that of a ladybug, 2 long antennae were protruding from its head. It wasn't dead yet. I had crushed its body, but its legs were still moving in a fruitless attempt to escape. I didn't get more than a quick glance at the pesky thing before another one scurried by me on the kitchen counter. One swat of my hand later, and both the little buggers were dead. I believed them to be pantry pests, like a rice weevil or something of that sort, though in time, I would come to discover that this theory was wrong. Lord knows how wrong I was. Naturally, Donald was of little use when it came to cleaning. I worked tirelessly just to keep the apartment livable, while he would completely undo everything by the time that I got back from school. As the weeks wore on, I started to realize I was fighting a losing battle. The good days were the ones where I could maintain equilibrium and go to sleep with the apartment looking no more dingy than when I woke up that morning. But I never cleaned fast enough to gain any ground on the chaos and clutter my brother created, while I scrubbed and scorned away at the stains on the carpet, or threw load after load of his dirty unmentionables in the washer. He would always be busy constructing another mountain of garbage for me to clean up. It was around this time that I began to develop genuine feelings of hatred for Donald. Those bothersome bugs had become a constant reminder of the filth that I was living in. I'd usually see them one or two at a time, sometimes congregating in the bathroom, trying to get into my tube of toothpaste, or crawling along the tops of cereal boxes in the cupboard. On occasion, I would feel that familiar prick on my arms or legs, and look down to find the nasty little vermin feeding on me. I had never lived in a home with pests before, but I was no fool. There were more of them hiding behind the walls. I was sure of it. Where there's one, there's a million. That's what they say about infestations. The thought of a thin layer of stucco being the only thing separating me from that army of insects made me tremble on more than one occasion. It frustrated me to know that it was my brother's bad habits that had most likely attracted them there in the first place. I would often daydream about inviting Elizabeth over to hang out, watch TV, and, well, do other things, but I knew that as long as my pest-ridden apartment continued to be treated like a garbage dump, our relationship could only remain a fantasy. How humiliating it would be if she saw how I was living! I was far too embarrassed to get close to her, and I had my brother to thank for that. Blast! Those idiots knocking at my door are nothing if not persistent. I keep telling them that I need more time, but it's clear they've become impatient with my stalling. I might as well skip to the important part of the story then. Things went from bad to worse the day I ran into Chuck Volderschmidt while he was smoking a cigarette down by the dumpsters behind my building. Chuck was a simple fellow, a second-year senior, only slightly brighter than my brother. He was one of the few residents of my apartment complex other than Donald, whom I had developed a strong distaste for in my short time living there. Maybe it was because he was the type of guy who majored in women's studies and took poetry as an elective, because it was a good place to meet dumb broads. The guy had all the honor and integrity of a used car salesman, and it wasn't hard to picture him 20 years from now working as a clerk behind the desk of a porn shop, balding and sporting the kind of pencil-thin mustache you only see on a child molester. I had just finished tossing away a garbage bag full of Donald's love tissues, which I had found all over his bedroom following one of his infamous all-day marathon sessions, when Chuck finally decided to acknowledge my presence. "Sup, man?" he said in the most comically detached, too cool to care voice I've ever heard. "What have you been up to? You missed a great party in 412 last week." "I've been busy with school, Chuck." That wasn't a lie. Acting as Donald's live-in maid afforded me little time to study. I was spending my downtime catching up with my classes. I continued on. "I know I haven't been around all that much. It's just that..." "Hey, check this out, man." He cut me off. Of course, he was only interested in sparking up a conversation because he wanted to brag about something. "You know Elizabeth in 303, right?" I raised an eyebrow. "Yeah? What about her?" "I totally finger-banged her in Jessica Barkowitz's bathroom at the party." "I don't believe you." "I didn't." "Seriously, man? Here, smell. He lifted his finger to my face. I swatted away. He giggled like an idiot while I silently talked myself down from cracking his skull open on the pavement. Yeah, man, I've been hitting it for a week now. She's totally into me, too. Best part is, I don't even need to buy her dinner or nothing. She just comes over and I smash that ass till the sun comes up. It took every ounce of my energy not to run my fist into the shit-eating grin on his face. I knew he wasn't trying to annoy me. He was just a moron. Chuck didn't know about my feelings for Elizabeth, and I'm sure if he did, the little coward wouldn't have dreamed about saying those things to me. Cool, man. Good for you, I said. I brushed past the smarmy boob on my way back to the building and proceeded up the stairs towards Elizabeth's apartment. If Chuck was telling people lies about her, then she deserved to know. My heart started to beat emphatically in my chest as I neared closer to her door. When I arrived, I knocked, then cupped my palm over my mouth once I heard her footsteps approaching. Exhaling in my palm in order to make sure my breath was pleasant, it smelled exquisitely minty and fresh as per usual. Elizabeth answered the door wearing the cutest pair of pink shorts and a workout top. "Oh, hi," I said, slightly taken back by the sight of her silky smooth legs. And suddenly I didn't care about Chuck Volderschmidt anymore. All I wanted was to place my arms around her lovely waist and run my fingers along her elegant curves. It was now or never. I had decided to finally man up and ask her out. I didn't care about her seeing my apartment anymore. Surely an angel like that would understand my plight. Maybe if things went well between us, I could even move out of my brother's place and in with Elizabeth. She stood leaning against the doorframe, watching me with a perplexed look on her face, probably wondering why I had shown up to her apartment. "What's up?" she asked me. "Elizabeth," I said. I was wondering if you'd like to grab a bite to eat sometime." She smiled, the most enchanting smile I've ever seen, and looked out at me with those sexy green eyes of hers before uttering a dispiriting string of words that ground my heart into powder and scattered its remains into the wind. "I'd love to, but I'm actually already kind of seeing Chuck Volderschmidt. You know him, right?" Chuck Volderschmidt. Chuck, no means yes, Captain Fingerbang fucking Volderschmidt. It isn't even fathomable how a woman like Elizabeth could find herself interested in a guy like him, yet somehow, as ridiculous and unlikely as it sounded, that was precisely what she told me. I don't remember what I said to her after that or how pathetic I looked as I slinked away from her door. All I do remember is that I ended up shuffling back to my apartment in a depressed haze with my tail tucked between my legs. Of course, Donald was asleep on the couch by the time I came back. When I had left, he had been laying in the same position watching TV, one hand in his pants cupping his balls, the other pinching the roach end of a joint. The place looked like hell. In the time that I was gone, he managed to knock over a glass of Hawaiian punch that was sitting on the coffee table, creating a large red stain on the carpet and leaving the living room looking like a crime scene. During his siesta, he dropped the still-burning roach on the rug and was lucky he hadn't started a fire. I shook my head in disgust as I picked it up off the floor. I decided a bit of busy work would help to take my mind off of Elizabeth and Chuck, so I began cleaning. Donald's bedroom was a good place to start. There was always something in there that reeked so bad that it could make a man forget his own name, so I grabbed the trash bag and made my way to the pig pen. My bag was about halfway filled with soda cans when I came across a pizza box from a local restaurant called Fat Sal's, sitting next to Donald's industrial-sized tube of hand lotion on the floor. I recognized the box. Donald ordered pizza from that place at least a couple of times a week. He and the delivery guy even seemed to be on a first-name basis. On the box's lid, an overweight Italian-American stereotype in a chef's hat was pictured. One hand rested on his pudgy hip, while the other extended a thumb into the air to go along with the portly chef's approving smile. There was no slogan written on the box, but I came up with an appropriate one in my head. So what if my food takes years off your life and gives you a worse complexion than the Toxic Avenger? At least it tastes good. Fat Sal. It was only morbid curiosity that motivated me to lift the lid. I was interested to know what it was about this place that made Donald prefer it over the 50,000 other pizza restaurants around campus. Perhaps I should have been better prepared for what I was about to see. After all, I'd surmised that a few weeks of cleaning Donald's disaster of a room is enough to desensitize anyone to even the most objectionable sights and smells, but for whatever reason, I wasn't ready for what was waiting for me beneath the obese chef's cardboard portrait. I felt my stomach drop the instant I raised the lid. Scuttling around inside of the box, crawling over leftover crust, and collecting around puddles of grease, like caribou at the watering hole, were dozens of those little black bugs. It was by far the most that I have ever seen in one place. A jolt of panic darted down my arm, causing me to drop the pest-ridden thing to the floor. The thud must have startled the insects, because next thing I knew, they were dispersing throughout the room, scurrying for cover in all directions. The thunderous blare of Donald breaking wind erupted from the living room, accompanied by a beastly snort that made me cringe so hard it caused my entire body to tremble. I followed the awful noise to find my brother still sawing wood on the sofa. Sordid thoughts of Elizabeth willingly allowing that perverted snake, Chuck Volderschmidt, to defile her hallowed Garden of Eden, and Jessica Barkowitz's bathroom once again started to swirl through my mind. It was Donald's fault. He was the reason that I had been afraid to ask Elizabeth out in the first place. All the filth he created, his disgusting lifestyle, I had been far too self-conscious to allow anyone close enough to me where they might learn the truth about him. And then it came to me. An answer so simple, I was shocked. I hadn't thought of it before. There was only one way that I could ever truly be happy. I had to get rid of Donald. Before I get to the next part of my story, I want to explain to you that I thought long and hard about how to deal with the situation. A crazy person might have acted on pure impulse after coming to the realization that had just made itself plainly apparent to me. But I'm no crazy person. I made certain to evaluate every possible option in exhausting detail before finally deciding to kill my brother. Once my choice had been made, I slowly crept towards the napping ogre. Although I'm sure that due to the marijuana-induced coma that he was currently sleeping off, I could have done cartwheels, and he wouldn't have woken up. Looking down at his chubby cheeks made me feel queasy. Quite honestly, I felt like I was about to do him a service, like putting down a mangy dog that's blind from cataracts and suffering from arthritis. I reveled in the moment as I cautiously wrapped my hands around his flabby neck, taking care not to wake him before I was in position. Then, in one rapid movement, I threw my body on top of his, straddling his tubby torso and squeezing his throat as hard as I could. Almost immediately, his eyes shot open, but his startled, terrified stare only helped to empower me. Donald may have been larger than me, but I was stronger. His muscles had atrophied due to the years of lounging around the apartment, while mine had become more developed from my daily routines in the gym. Desperate pleas of mercy sporadically leaked from his mouth, but I couldn't make out a word he was saying, nor did I care to hear them. I could feel his windpipe crushing under the grip of my hands, the pressure causing his eyes to bulge from his head like one of those goofy stress management toys that at least one jackass had on his desk in every single office on the planet. It surprised me how long it took to finish the job. I must have been at it for at least 10 minutes before I was sure he was dead. By the end of it, I was drenched in sweat. Lactic acid rushed through the muscles of my arms, producing a mild burning sensation in my biceps and triceps. Donald's face had turned a grayish hue. Black and purple rings encircled the fat neck where my hands had been choking him. His tongue hung from his mouth like a dog stuck out in the sun without a bowl of water. As I looked at my dead brother, not an ounce of remorse lingered in my consciousness. Donald had brought death on himself. As far as I was concerned, my brother was barely alive before I strangled him. I knew that keeping him in the apartment would not be wise. Storing his corpse was something only a psychopath like Ed Gein or John Wayne Gacy would do. Eventually, his body would rot and smell even more than the apartment itself, and people would complain. If enough tenants raised a fuss, the landlord would demand to investigate. And then I'd be finished. My parents' summer home was only an hour and a half from the university. I was positive that I could get rid of it there. All I needed to do was sneak his body to my car in the parking garage, without anyone noticing. Transporting Donald's corpse from the living room to my car turned out to be easier than I thought it would be. It was midterms week, and most of my building's occupants were locked away inside of their apartments, cramming for exams or pulling all-nighters at the library. There were always oversized cardboard boxes discarded by tenants after whatever furniture delivered inside of them had been removed, stacked up next to the dumpsters behind my building. I selected the biggest one that I could find and headed back to my unit with it. Donald's limp body felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds, but the adrenaline coursing through my veins gave me the strength to hoist his hefty cadaver into the box without too much difficulty. I dragged the thing down the hall to the elevator and up to my sedan, trying my best to appear as inconspicuous as possible. Luckily for me, I didn't run into any inquiring minds eager to know what was inside of the package I was hauling. Could you imagine? I'd probably be forced to blubber out some sort of pitiful Jack Tripper-esque excuse if people ask questions, just like an episode of Three's Company, only with less boobs and more murder. The drive up to my parents' summer house was a quiet one. I didn't feel like listening to the radio, and Donald wasn't in the mood to do much talking. I was surprisingly calm for having just committed fratricide. To be honest, I was more relieved Donald was dead than distraught. He was a terrible brother, and from what I could tell, growing up, he wasn't much of a son to my parents either. Once the matter of his body was taken care of, I would be able to get back to school and start living a normal life. I had a plan, in case you were wondering. Only a complete whack job would kill someone without an exit strategy. My parents' vacation home was conveniently secluded and located on a massive lake. When I was little, my father and I used to take his old rowboat out on the water before Donald or my mother would wake up, so we could go fishing. We'd spend the morning together, usually catching nothing and waiting for the sun to peek out from over the eastern hills, while he spouted off obscure trivia to me about the lake. Yep. This lake has a surface area of approximately 17 square miles, he'd say to me. It's been measured at 518 feet at its deepest point. Better keep your arms and legs in the boat. No telling what could happen down there. Just about anything could hide in a body of water this big. He always said that last part just to get a rise out of me. But the sheer size of the lake always stuck with me. There was some truth to his teasing. Anything could hide down there, even my blob of a brother. My plan was to dump his corpse in the lake and ditch my car 10 miles south of my school, the opposite direction of my folks' summer home. From there, I would have to find a ride back to campus. If I could make it to the school before people in my building started waking up, no one would realize that I had even left. A little later, I could report my brother missing and my car stolen. It wouldn't be hard to make it look like he'd taken my car. I could leave his sweatshirt in the back seat, smear his fingerprints all over the steering wheel, and maybe even sprinkle a little of his hair around to make it seem like he was driving it. Donald had a couple minor run-ins with the law when he was younger. Nothing major. He got hit with a misdemeanor for marijuana possession when he was 17, some vandalism stuff when he was a little younger, but compared to my squeaky clean record, he looked like a felon. Convincing the police that he had finally gone off the deep end and skipped out of town wouldn't be a problem. I pulled my car around to the back of the lake house and killed my headlights. The closest neighbors lived about a mile away, but I was taking no chances by unnecessarily drawing attention to myself. It was getting late. The clock on my dashboard flashed 11:30. The light from the numbers bathed the inside of my car in a pale green glow. For a few seconds, nothing felt real to me, like I had somehow been transported into the plot of a David Lynch movie. I quickly snapped myself back to reality and got to work. I dragged Donald's corpse from the trunk and lugged it down the gravel path that led towards my father's tool shed. I had one more precaution I needed to take in order to make sure I wouldn't be caught. If watching hours upon hours of Horatio Caine, catching bad guys and solving murders down on South Beach taught me anything, it's that no matter how terrible the crime, there's always time for an inappropriate stomach-groaning pun. Yeah! If it taught me anything else, it's that dental records and fingerprints are by far the easiest way to identify a body. Donald may have been dead, but he still had a mouthful of teeth in all 10 of his fingers. My dad's shed, however, stored a sturdy set of pliers and a handy pair of heavy-duty pruning shears. I think you can put two and two together and figure out where this is going. I rolled Donald's cumbersome corpse the final few feet through the shed door and propped it upright against the wall. I must have inherited my affinity for tidiness from my father. He always kept his things so neat and orderly. Suffices to say, his shed was no exception. I had little trouble locating the pliers I would need to remove my brother's teeth. The operation, I estimated, would most likely be a bloody one, so I decided to reel out the blue plastic tarp that was propped up in the corner in order to catch any DNA evidence that might escape my brother's mouth while I yanked away at his brownish-yellow smoke-stained incisors. I had just finished laying it down on the floor when I noticed something out of the corner of my eye that made every muscle in my neck go rigid and sent wave after wave of fright pulsating throughout my body. I blinked thrice, silently praying to God, Jesus, Buddha, Krishna, and any other holy deity who might have happened to be observing the scene, that what I had just witnessed out of my peripheral vision was nothing but an optical illusion. Unfortunately for me, my prayers had gone unanswered because my vision had not deceived me. Donald's chest was moving. I was too afraid to turn my head. An hour earlier, he was dead. I had even checked his pulse. People don't just come back to life, I told myself. That was something a crazy person would believe. Slowly, I rotated my neck in his direction in order to get a better look. What happened next was something I had not been able to forget in the days since the incident, no matter how hard I've tried. Donald's body still sat limp against the wall of the shed. The skin of his lifeless face had gone from gray to pale white during the drive. There was nothing in his cold, empty stare that could have suggested any signs of vitality or even a single trace of consciousness, yet his chest was clearly throbbing up and down with alarming frequency. I tried to swallow but realized my mouth had gone bone dry. With a thud, his body slumped to the floor, causing me to jump 3 feet off the ground. The trunk of his core continued to move. He was laying on his back now, his colorless face turned in my direction, perhaps against my better judgment. I called out to him. "Donald?" I managed to mutter out. There was no reply. The only thing I could hear was the sound of my own heavy breathing. Moments later, Donald's body began to stir. Slowly at first, but gradually his motions became more violent. I fought back a scream as his carcass started to convulse and writhe on the shed's floor just a couple of feet from where I was standing. His arms and legs were flailing through the air while his torso shook and jerked like he was having a seizure. A low hiss seeped from his mouth, the sound that violated my ears while I trembled with fright from the scene unfolding before me. No. This can't be happening. This can't be real, I thought to myself. But it was happening, and I can tell you with the utmost sincerity that this was real. The hiss grew louder. I covered my ears with my hands and shook my head in disbelief. Donald's jaw started to twitch, as if he was trying to talk. I was terrified of hearing his voice, of hearing the damn words I expected to come out of his mouth. But it wasn't words that emerged from between my brother's lips that evening. No, sir. What came out instead was much more horrifying. An endless stream of those little black bugs began to pour from his mouth, flooding the room like a biblical plague and swarming nearly everything in sight. They scuttled along my shoes and up my pant legs. I swatted at them frantically, doing everything in my power to get the vermin off me, but the more I brushed them away, the more they overran me. The lake, I remembered, still crawling with bugs. I leapt over Donald's now motionless body, burst through the shed's door, and made a break for the dock right next to my house. I was moving as fast as the evening's cool air began stinging my face while I sprinted through the darkness. When I reached the end of the dock, I threw myself headfirst into the icy cold water without hesitation in an attempt to drown the bugs still clinging to me. In all the excitement and panic, I forgot to close my mouth and hold my breath before diving into the lake. The frigid water rushed down my esophagus in an effort to invade my respiratory system, nearly drowning me in the freezing depths. Frantically, I kicked and thrashed underneath the surface, trying to make it to the dock's ladder, while water continued to usurp the air in my lungs. With one last desperate attempt at survival, I grasped onto one of the ladder's rungs and yanked myself free of the drink, into the night air, gasping and choking in the moonlight. Exhausted, but relieved to be alive, I sogged my shaking body back up to the dock and collapsed on its deck. I had little time to relax, though. There was still work to be done. Donald's body wasn't going to dispose of itself, and I knew that I needed to move fast if I wanted to be back at the school by sunrise. The bugs were mostly gone by the time that I had gone back to the shed. They must have scattered into the backyard or the wooded area that surrounded the house when I made my dash towards the lake. A few of them had stuck around and were lingering on the floor and walls while I returned, but I could cope with that. There really wasn't time to stop and contemplate the peculiarity of what I had just witnessed. I was well aware of the inexplicable circumstances surrounding the little black bugs and Donald's body. Never in my life had I ever heard or read about anything so odd or terrifying, but I was on the clock. In order to secure my alibi, I needed to finish the job and get back to school. I picked up the set of pliers, dragged my brother on top of the tarp, and kneeled down next to his corpse. Some of the insects were still trickling out of the corners of his mouth. I brushed them away and got down to business. I pulled each and every one of my brother's teeth out with the pliers. His hands were a bit harder to remove with the shears than I thought they would be, but my father's DeWalt diamond-tipped, heavy-duty handsaw did a satisfactory enough job. I don't know why a handsaw needs to be diamond-tipped. All my father ever did with it was cut firewood, but I was more than thankful for his testosterone-fueled purchase that evening. Needless to say, it sliced through my brother's wrists faster than an emo kid looking for attention. I wrapped what was left of his body up in the blood-soaked tarp, and lugged it all the way back to the dock where my father's rowboat was tied up. It was late, and with the weather as cold as it was, I knew I wouldn't see anyone else in the lake. Not at this time of the year, anyway. For about 20 minutes I paddled out, not stopping until I knew I was in a place where the water would be deep. Next, I deadlifted Donald's fat carcass up from the boat and dumped it overboard. It sunk down into the murky depths, disappearing from sight like attractive people at a Magic the Gathering tournament. I chucked the teeth that I had extracted into the lake as well, watching them gradually scatter and vanish beneath the surface. When I got back to land, I used the hands that I had removed to plant Donald's fingerprints all over my steering wheel and the dashboard of my car before burying them out in the woods. I made sure to straighten up the shed so my father wouldn't find anything amiss the next time that he was in it. Before I left the lake house that night, I went inside and headed up to my parents' bedroom. My father kept a revolver in the nightstand by his bed, and I figured it might come in handy somewhere down the line. Just a contingency plan in case things started to spiral out of control. Crazy people don't come up with contingency plans, so you can see how clear and level-headed my thinking was. I got back in the car and fired up the engine. All I needed to do was ditch my ride, then I'd be home free. A tiny, painful prick on my neck startled me momentarily, breaking my concentration. I reached back and snatched the little black bug that had bitten me, pinching it between my fingers. It tried to squirm away, but I crushed its body before it could, popping it like a pimple, while I laughed maniacally at its plight like a supervillain, high on shrooms. I left my car in the parking lot of a Carl's Jr. about 20 minutes southeast of my campus. I'm not really sure why I chose Carl's Jr. I guess it just seemed like an appropriate place for Donald's trail to run cold. One last double Western bacon cheeseburger for the fat ass before his vanishing act. My school was too far travel for foot, so running was out of the question, and I was concerned that calling for a cab would be an easy way to get noticed in case the police came snooping around, looking for witnesses. I needed to stay as discreet as possible. My alibi would be a failure if someone like a cabbie could pinpoint me in the general proximity of the car I had planned on reporting stolen. Even though it was likely I would encounter people on the bus, I reasoned that since it was still early, no one would be interested in making conversation or even eye contact, especially not before the break of dawn. I had studied the bus routes earlier. There was an express line that I could catch that would drop me off near the school. The first bus was supposed to come up by 5 a.m. and only made a few stops before reaching the campus. I checked my watch. It was 4:30. With any luck, my ride would be on time and I could make it back to the apartment before people started waking up. I took a seat on the bench and waited alone in the dark for the bus to arrive. Just a few minutes later, a scruffy old hobo hobbled up the bus stop and popped a squat next to me. A pungent stench wafted through the air. I winced in realization that I was sitting downwind from the homeless man's foul fragrance, an awful combination of urine and rancid milk. I scooted over until one of my ass cheeks was hanging off the edge of the bench, attempting to put as much distance between myself and the terrible funk as possible. The vagrant sat hunched over with his hands inside the pockets of his dirty, ragged sweatshirt, while he mumbled something incoherent to himself. His hood was pulled up over his head, covering most of his face, but from what I could see, he looked as if he was in desperate need of some dental work. He started to rock back and forth on the bench as the unintelligible garble spewed from his mouth became larger and more frequent. Still, I couldn't make out what the troubled man was saying. I checked my watch. It was only 4:37. I remember the time exactly because that's when things began to get strange. We were all alone at the bus stop. Aside from the occasional car zipping by, there wasn't another soul in sight. None of the stores around were open yet, so there was no warm, safe place for me to duck into while I waited for the bus to show. The homeless man clenched his decaying, rotten teeth and began to violently shake his fist in the air. His ramblings had turned into a fit of angry shouting, and I finally started to understand what he had been saying once the raving lunatic started barking into the dark morning sky. "He's dead! He's dead! His own flesh and blood, his baby brother! Why? Why, baby brother?" I shot up from the bench and stumbled back for a few steps. I told myself that he was just some maniac, that there was no way that he could know about Donald, but somewhere, deep inside me, I couldn't shake the feeling that all his hooting and hollering was directed towards me. I checked my watch again. It was only 4:43. Time was moving slower than an octogenarian wearing ankle weights. He stood up from the bench and started shambling towards me like a zombie, all the while continuing to shout out accusations at the top of his lungs. "Why, baby brother? Murder! His own flesh and blood! I backed off into the street, but Nostra Homeless followed. A flash of light illuminated the dark road that we were both now standing in. I turned my head to see the bus that I'd been waiting on about a block away, sitting at a red light. Salvation, I thought to myself. It had arrived early, but before I had the chance to rejoice, the mad hobo lunged at me, grasping me around my wrists with both his hands. He lifted his head and met my terrified gaze. For the first time, I could see his entire face, and I felt myself get woozy from the appalling sight staring back at me. His lips were horribly chapped, so dry and cracked that blood began to trickle from their pussy sores as he smiled his rotten grin. The bizarre homeless man's teeth were worse than I thought. The black and yellow giblets jutted out from the bum's disease-ridden gums in arbitrary directions, sometimes even overlapping each other. As he continued to squawk at me, I noticed an additional sound beginning to emanate from the homeless man's mouth. It was a terrible, low hiss, one that I had heard earlier that evening in the tool shed. Right before the bugs began to spill from the mouth of my dead brother, I felt myself get sick at the mere thought of those things swarming me back at the lake house. "He's dead!" he shouted. "Baby brother, why? Murdered by his own flesh!" I was too terrified to look away. The hiss became louder as bugs began to crawl out of the homeless man's nose, scurrying down his face. I broke his grip, falling over backwards onto my rear end, and started to shuffle away on the ground as fast as I could. The light on the street got brighter, and I realized the bus was advancing towards me. Seeing this, the deranged homeless man darted out of the road, leaving me sitting there in the asphalt as the express line pulled up to the stop. The last thing that I needed to do was miss my bus, so I stood up, dusted myself off, and headed for the door. The driver didn't even look twice at me as I boarded. I'm sure she's seen her fair share of crazy working that route. I was thankful for it, too. As far as I was concerned, the less people that could pick me out of a lineup, the better. There were only 2 other riders on the bus, and both of them looked half asleep. I took a seat in the very back and tried to catch my breath. Could he have known about Donald? No, I told myself. Something like that just doesn't make sense. It would be completely illogical to assume that the stinking schizoid had any knowledge of what happened between my brother and I. I was able to eventually reason that he must have been talking about someone else. You see? A sensible person could always come up with a rational explanation for things. I sat in a daze for the rest of the ride back to campus, trying to erase the mental image of those bugs moving around the homeless man's face. I still see it when I close my eyes. I still hear them hissing, too. Only I know that's not in my head. I stumbled into my apartment before daybreak. I had forgotten how messy the place was before I left. It was okay, though. I took great pleasure in fixing up the place, knowing that it would be the last time I ever had to clean up one of my brother's messes. Fatigue settled in by the time I was wrapping up, and I collapsed on my bed, where I fell asleep for hours. By the time I woke up, the sun was already making its descent from the sky. Every single one of my muscles ached, and the joints in my arms and legs burned as if they were on fire. I realized that the night had taken a greater toll on my body than I originally anticipated. All I wanted to do was lie in bed and not move until the pain went away. But I knew my job wasn't done yet. I had to pad my alibi. I called the police and reported my car stolen. After about an hour of waiting, an incredibly bored-looking cop came by and took down my information. He seemed even less impressed when I divulged to him that my brother was most likely the culprit. The expression on the officer's face told me he'd much rather have been at a donut shop, sipping coffee and talking football with the rest of the boys than dealing with me. Nevertheless, I put on an act for him that even Lawrence Oliver would have been jealous of. "Oh, please, officer, tell me if you hear anything. Honestly, I'm more worried about Donald than my car. I think he may have finally lost it." The cop nodded his head, reassured me that everything would probably be alright, and drove off in his squad car, presumably to get back to his busy day of consuming coffee and chowing down on bear claws, while debating Tom Brady versus Peyton Manning with the rest of his overweight, mustached compatriots. I was confident that my performance would be enough to throw the police off my trail. Excluding the psychopath at the bus stop and the hiccup with the bugs in the tool shed, Everything was going as I had envisioned. It wasn't until later that evening that my plan would begin to fall apart. And fall apart it did. I remember the exact point things started to go haywire. How could I forget? My life has been a case of situational irony akin to that of Shakespearean comedy. And how appropriate is it that the catalyst, the very thing that got the ball rolling, was an all too familiar prick on the back of my neck. I was sitting at the desk in my room when it happened. Disposing of my brother's body had cost me a lot of very valuable study time, and I was trying to take advantage of every minute that I had left before my midterm exams by burying myself in my coursework. The sting of the insect's bite took me by surprise, snapping my attention away from the textbook that I was reading. I let out a yelp and twisted in my chair, attempting to swat the irritating little nuisance off of me, but paused, suddenly stricken with fear when I took notice of a sound that had begun to infiltrate the room, one I was starting to become far too acquainted with. A low hiss seeped through the walls, the hiss of those little black bugs. The noise seemed to be loudest coming from the wall on the opposite end of my room near the foot of my bed. I approached what appeared to be its origin cautiously and ran my fingers along the wall. Terror's dark hand gripped me tight as the vibrating stucco sent tiny tremors up my finger when I touched it. I could feel them moving, crawling, even squirming over top of each other, just behind the thin plaster barricade between us. The thought made the contents of my stomach rise halfway up my throat. The hiss began to get loud. It became deafening. I jerked my hand back from the wall as the terrible noise persisted to increase in intensity. The bedroom wall was throbbing now, just like Donald's chest in my father's tool shed one night prior. I feared that any moment the bugs could come bursting through the wall like a pus spurting from the center of a ripe zit. I barely had time to cringe in fear from the terrible sight before the hiss began to change, mutating and warping itself into something that sounded like words. The voice was inhuman, unlike anything I'd ever heard before, almost as if it was speaking to me through the sound of flesh sizzling over an open flame. "He's dead. He is dead. Why, baby brother? Why?" The words pervaded my ears and burrowed themselves into my brain like a parasite. I turned to run, but toppled over the ottoman, jamming my left wrist when I put my hand out in front of me to break my fall. I looked towards the wall again where the hiss had originated. It was moving as if half my bedroom had begun breathing. "You killed him. Why?" The wall continued to swell up and down like the waves of an angry sea. I began to prepare myself for the worst. I was certain that death would be riding into my room in next to no time, a six-eyed horseman with the mandibles of an anthropod, ready to drag my soul to hell. "He was ours. Now you'll be too. You'll be ours, or we'll ruin you," I screamed. The wall was writhing and twisting in ways that defied physics. The entire room looked like a bad acid trip. "You'll be ours, or nothing." It was maddening. If I didn't know for sure that my mind was so healthy and sound, I might have believed that I was losing it. Of course, a crazy person would never acknowledge that kind of complete and utter insanity to be anything out of the norm. I, however, was well aware of the implausible situation that I had found myself in, thus proving the lucidity of my mental state of being. I curled up into a ball and shut my eyes, cradling my head in my hands, reverting back to the most primal of self-defense mechanisms. The walls were closing in on me, and the hiss had reached an unbearable pitch. But just when I thought a certain doom was upon me, another noise filled the apartment. A knock on the front door. It took a minute for me to gather myself, but eventually I noticed that the walls had returned back to normal, and that the hiss had vanished almost as soon as the knocking had begun. Another knock brought me to my feet, and I proceeded to the door, albeit still shakily. To my surprise, Chuck Volderschmidt and Elizabeth were standing in front of me when I opened it. Chuck was shirtless, although his pasty white chest and sunburned forearms made him look like he was wearing a t-shirt. Elizabeth, looking as stunning as ever, was wearing nothing but an oversized G-Unit football jersey. The kind of shirt that you might find bundled up on the floor at a Burlington coat factory or Nordstrom rack. I winced a bit once I came to the realization that it was most likely Chuck's. "Bro," said the turd, "we thought that we heard a scream. Is everything okay, or were you just watching porn with the speakers turned up too loud? Because I do that sometimes." No, Chuck. Thanks for your concern, but I tripped over the ottoman in my room and sprained my wrist." "Ouch," said Elizabeth. And it was that moment that I decided that the G in G-Unit must have stood for goddess. "Do you need a doctor?" I shook my head and forced a laugh. No, just startled myself, I guess. I should watch where I'm going." "Fucking A, you should," chimed Chuck. "Next time I hear a scream like that from this apartment, it better be because you have a hot biatch here. LOL. He actually said LOL. Chuck grabbed a handful of Elizabeth's magnificent rump. "Come on, babe. Let's get back to your apartment." He turned towards me and mouthed something that rhymes with "meeting that wussy" when she wasn't looking, mouth thrusting his pelvis in the air and flicking his tongue between the peace sign he was making with his fingers as they walked away. I shut the door behind me and leaned against the wall, trying to get a grasp on everything that had just occurred. Part of me was still terrified that the hiss would begin anew and my six-legged tormentors would pick up where they left off. But deep down inside, I knew they wanted me alive. The bugs were actually speaking to me. Not just speaking, but delivering a message. A warning. Now you'll be ours too. You'll be ours, or we'll ruin you. I understood. I understood what they meant. Those little bastards were the only witnesses to Donald's murder. The bugs loved my older brother. He was like a benevolent god to them. They gorged themselves on the heaping piles of garbage that he left lying around the apartment. The place was like a paradise for those terrible little things, and then I moved in and took it all away, and now they wanted me to take his place, to maintain the status quo and continue showering them with gifts. It was a threat. Become as foul and nasty as my older brother, return their home to paradise, or somehow they would ruin me. Oh, if it was a god they wanted, and it was a god they were going to get. But not the kind that they were asking for. I was about to go Old Testament on the little black bugs. It's the police who kept knocking at my door. They won't say they're the cops. Actually, they won't say much of anything. It doesn't really matter, though. I know it's them. They must be here to arrest me for what I did to Donald. I'm sure the smug sons of bitches are going to pat themselves on the back for breaking the case. The idiots. I was careful. They never would have known if it wasn't for those goddamn bugs. I purchased a fogger at Home Depot the following day. I don't know much about exterminating, so I let the guys at the store convince me to splurge on the most expensive one that they had. It came in a canister that looked like an old Soviet warhead. On the side of it was a picture of a mushroom cloud with the words "Big Bug Bomb" written in bold yellow font that told me it meant business. When I got back to the apartment, I set it up in my bedroom, the site of my earlier run-ins with the little pests. The instructions on the container said that the fogger released a cloud of poisonous gas capable of reaching a radius of 2,500 square feet, which is a distance that's easily more than twice the size of my humble living accommodations. All I had to do was pull the tab, leave the apartment for a couple of hours, and let the gas do the work. I was positive the bugs would mount an attack and come gushing through the walls in an effort to thwart me, but it never happened. I set off the bomb just like the instructions said, placed the fogger down on my desk, and escaped with zero resistance. I thought that I'd be able to forget about everything that had taken place while I was at school that day, but unfortunately, my midterm exams weren't even going to help me ignore the constant reminders. I would look into my study materials, doing my damnedest to take my mind off the recent horrors that I had experienced, but no matter how much I tried to clear my mind, terrible memories still plagued me. At times, I could have sworn I smelled the homeless man's nauseating aroma as I ambled around my campus. I feared he would be waiting for me every time I turned a corner, shouting accusations at the top of his lungs like he had that night at the bus stop. To anyone watching, I must have looked like quite the nut, peering over my shoulder every 10 feet or so, keeping an eye out for the invisible boogeyman. Then, there were the things that weren't in my head. Over the course of the day, I would catch people giving me the most judgmental, scornful looks, 2 girls whispering to each other and pointing in my direction as I walked by, a professor shaking his head when I turned in my tests, even the barista in my coffee shop turning her nose up at me when I stopped in to get a mid-afternoon pick-me-up. I was beginning to feel the paranoia seeping in, the way everyone was glaring at me. It was as if they knew what I had done to Donald. I ducked into the library to get away from the judgmental sneers and disapproving stares. I needed a quiet place to think and clear my head, but the coffee I guzzled down hadn't given me the caffeine boost that I was looking for, and I quickly found myself nodding off at the desk in the computer lab once I settled in. My nap was far from restful, though. The vividness of my nightmare saw to that. The warmth and safety of the library faded away, only to be replaced by the last place on Earth I wanted to be. I barely had time to realize I was back at the lake again, treading along the surface of the icy water that I had dumped my brother in, when I felt myself begin to sink. I tried to swim, but no matter how hard I kicked and paddled, I couldn't free myself from the water's pull. It began to envelop me, slowly but surely swallowing my body whole. I took one last desperate gasp of air as my head submerged under the surface of the lake. 10 feet underwater and sinking fast, a sense of hopelessness began to overwhelm me. I stopped trying to fight my way to the surface. When I reached 40 feet, I could feel the pressure in my ears and behind my eyes start to build. It felt like my head was beginning to crush in a vice. 100 feet, and plunging deeper, my lungs felt as though they were going to burst. No longer able to stand the pain, I opened my mouth and screamed and felt the lake rush down my throat just as it had when I dove into the water the night I killed Donald. Deeper I descended into the darkness, suffering, drowning, a victim of the water's merciless onslaught, when I saw something waiting for me at the lake bed. Dread shot through my already agonizing body when I recognized what I was being pulled towards. My brother's bloated corpse was sitting at the bottom of the lake, his body hanging halfway out of the tarp that I had rolled him in. Days of water damage had turned his skin a sickening greenish white. The fish had reached him by then, and few of them were still feeding on the exposed flesh of his face as I touched down to the lake's floor. His eyeballs were gone. They're always the first place to be eaten. It's the easiest part of the body for the fish to digest. I read that somewhere. We were now face to eyeless, partially consumed face. To my horror, his puffy, swollen lips began to slowly move. He was speaking to me, and somehow, under hundreds of feet of unforgiving, freezing cold water, I could hear him. "They're not dead," he said to me in a wheezy, croaking voice. It reminded me just how hard I had squeezed his throat that night. "You can't get rid of them. He stared at me through the empty sockets of his face with the same disdain that I had once viewed him with. "They want to make you like me." I wanted to respond. Freezing water gagging and choking me prevented any sort of retort. A smile crossed his decaying, half-eaten face, and I could tell that he was pleased by this. I'd even go as far as to say that he was laughing at my plight. "You'll be theirs," he said. "You'll be theirs, or they'll ruin you." A deep, low hiss began to flood my ears. If the lake hadn't already collapsed my lungs, I would have been shrieking at the top of them. The hiss grew louder and louder as my brother began to open his mouth. Once more, the noise had become deafening. Donald's mouth had stretched far too wide, as if he had unhinged his jaw, making his horrible face even harder to look at. Then, in an instant, I was back in the library, my cheek flush against the desk that I had fallen asleep on. I had woken up. It took seconds for reality to settle in. It took a few horrid gasps, trying to remember what breathing felt like. The dream had felt so real. Once I got my bearings back, I sat and reflected on it for a while. Donald's words had sent a chill down my spine. "They want to make you like me," he had told me. "You'll be theirs or they'll ruin you." I looked up. The librarian, a pretty undergrad, was scowling at me from behind her desk. Everyone I was coming in contact with seemed to hate me. There was only one possibility. It had to be the bugs. I found myself contemplating the possibility of that idea. Sure, it was crazy, but what other reason could there possibly been for my recent status as a social pariah? The little bastards had demonstrated that they had the ability to communicate. Perhaps they were telling the others, revealing to them my dirty secret. Maybe that's what they meant when they said that they would ruin me. My brother was most likely right. There was no way some stupid fogger I purchased at the hardware store was going to kill off those things. They had some sort of... I know it sounds nuts. Supernatural abilities that extended way beyond resistance to insecticides. Their motives had become clear to me. Either I gave in to their whims, or they were going to rat me out. A feeling of desperation started to brew inside me. I needed to exterminate them, once and for all. My fears were confirmed when I heard the hiss coming from my apartment before I had even made it halfway down the hall. The big bug bomb had performed about as well as a quadriplegic in an Iron Man competition. It didn't matter. They might have been able to fend off the noxious fumes of the fogger. But I had a new plan. If the pesticide didn't work, then maybe fire would do the trick. In my backpack was a case of matches. In my right hand was a can of gasoline. In my mind was the unrelenting desire to finally rid myself of those little black bugs. They weren't hard to find when I opened the door. The little buggers were everywhere. I locked the door behind me and quickly began splashing the walls of the living room with petrol. Again, that terrible hiss started to buzz through the apartment, and I knew that the bugs were assembling, preparing for war. Unlike before, though, I found the sound encouraging. The bug bomb didn't even frighten them enough to warrant a reaction. The fact that they were stirring made me think that I had them on the ropes a little bit. I knew that I needed to work fast. It would be important to hit every room so the bugs wouldn't have a place to run to once I set the apartment ablaze. For once, they were afraid, and I was reveling in it. "You like that, you little bastards?" I shouted. "I'll teach you to snitch on me." After I finished in the living room, I ran to the kitchen where those awful things had first bitten me. The hiss followed close behind. Once more, the appalling sound assaulting my ears began to form words. "You can't do this," You're ours now. I ignored the threats and continued to paint the walls and counters with gas. Stop this, the hiss commanded. I started to laugh out loud. The bathroom was next. By the time I got in there, the bugs had begun seeping out of the shower head, trickling from the sink, even crawling their way up from the drains. I ran the faucets in an effort to drown as many of them as possible. Somehow, I kept my composure long enough to spill some gasoline on the walls next to the toilet. Stop it! Stop it! Stop it! The nasty things hissed at me. I staggered out of the bathroom like a drunk girl in a nightclub and bumbled my way down the hall towards Donald's room. Even with the stench of gas spreading through the apartment, I could still smell my brother's distinctive funk when I entered his lair. For all I knew, it would have managed to linger even after the room had been reduced to ashen embers. I had just begun dousing his bed's disgusting bacteria-ridden sheets when a sudden thud caught me on the back of my head, knocking me to the ground and causing me to drop the gas can. I felt my vision blur and my head become as light as a balloon. Two obvious signs that I likely experienced a concussion. Blood started to dribble from the back of my head, where I had been struck, spilling down my neck and onto the floor, and an even more obvious sign that I likely experienced a concussion. Woozy, but still determined, I willed myself to wobbly feet. The blow on the back of my skull had raised more than a few questions in my acting head, questions that were answered as soon as my eyes began to regain their focus. It was standing in the doorway. At first, I thought that it was some sort of hallucination and an image of delirium brought on by my recent head trauma, but the longer I tried to convince myself that what I was looking at was imaginary, the more I realized it wasn't. Its shape was vaguely anthropomorphic. I say vaguely because it seemed to be trying to mimic the human form, but failing miserably at it. The figure had arms, legs, a tiny lump where the neck should be that looked like a sorry attempt for a head. It was black as soot. So dark, in fact, that I didn't realize at first that what I thought was its skin was actually moving. But it was. You see, this lone, dark figure that had apparently struck me wasn't a single entity at all. No, sir. It was an assemblage of those little black bugs, millions of them, all converging together like Voltron. I scrambled for the gas can, but the abomination tackled me back down to the floor. A multitude of tiny insect legs tickled my skin as the monstrosity pinned me to the ground with its makeshift hands. It was extremely strong. I squirmed and tugged as hard as I could, but I couldn't break its grip. The hiss of the bugs was so loud at this point that I was positive my ears were going to start bleeding. You'll be ours. You'll be ours right now. The figure pinning me to the ground suddenly began to disperse as the little black bugs, thousands at a time, launched into an attack. I was swarmed with them, and not just externally. They invaded every orifice of my body. I could feel them crawling up my nostrils, maneuvering in and out of my sinuses. They traveled down my trachea, using it as a tunnel, and scurrying along the inside walls of my lungs. I tried to cry out, but the screams were stifled by the thousands of bugs flooding my mouth. That wasn't the only place the nasty things decided to violate, though. They entered me through every part of my body, even making themselves at home in my digestive tract and my urethra. The pain was immeasurable. The last thing that I remember was passing out in agony, that horrible hiss, drowning everything out as the world faded to black. I wish I could tell you that the bugs were gone when I came to, or that I somehow found a way to expel them from my body, but I'm afraid that I would be lying if I did. You see, they attacked me a day ago and haven't actually stopped since. I woke up on the floor of my brother's room in more pain than when I had passed out, my skin on fire from the millions of bites that I had suffered since they started swarming me. The slew of bugs crawling up and down my throat makes it feel like I'm breathing through a straw. I swallow them by the hundreds. But more just keep coming to replace them. They've probably laid eggs inside of my intestines by now. It's okay though, because I've won and they know it. That's why they called the cops on me. Even when they invaded my body, I refused to cave to their demands. I refused to become my brother, and they hate me for it. Pretty soon the little bastards won't be able to torment anyone ever again. My father's revolver is sitting in my lap as I write this, and I have every intention of using it before the police come crashing through my door. But it gets better! The carpet is still soaked in gasoline, and I sure as hell don't plan on going out alone. It should only take one match to turn this whole apartment building into a scene from Backdraft. So, adios world, and a very special goodbye to those little black bugs. I suppose we'll meet again in hell. I'll be smiling when I see them though. 'Cause I know the score. From the Miskatonic Times. October 22nd, 2013. 6 dead in student housing fire. Police investigating possible arson. 6 people were killed in a tragic fire that occurred at a student housing building located off the university campus late Tuesday night. Many of the building's tenants were able to evacuate the scene. The building was reportedly engulfed in flames even before first responders had arrived. Witnesses say they were awoken by a gunshot coming from the apartment that the fire is believed to have started in. The fire spread fast, said Fire Chief Bill Marshall. The death toll might have been much higher if the gunshot hadn't alerted many of the building's residents. The shot is thought to have been fired by a third-year student, Donald Miller. Both the fire and gunshot were suspected to have emanated from his apartment. Miller lived alone, and those who had met him described the junior to be extremely introverted. I didn't know him too well, said one of the neighbors who survived the fire, but he was always so hard on himself when we did speak. He really seemed to have self-esteem issues. It was strange. He was constantly cleaning his apartment and complaining about how dirty it was. I never saw the inside of it. I don't think anybody did, but I couldn't imagine it being as bad as he said. It seemed like every other day I would see him walking to his door with a shopping bag full of cleaning supplies. Miller's mother and father declined to speak to the Miskatonic Times about whether or not they believe their only son was responsible for the fire, but have offered their condolences to all of those who lost their loved ones in the tragic event. Miller's body was one of 6 recovered from the fire. The coroner's report states that he died from a fatal gunshot wound to the head shortly after the fire started. There were no drugs or alcohol present in his body at the time of his death. However, some of the coroner's findings have raised questions about Miller's death. According to the report, even though he was not badly burned, his body was recovered with severe skin damage. These injuries do not appear to be inflicted from the fire and may possibly have been caused by insect bites. His body has been transported to St. Joseph's Medical Center, so tests can be run. The Miskatonic police are currently investigating Donald Miller's role in the fire.